For many teams, this year's NBA trade deadline hasn't had nearly the impact they expected. Take the Indiana Pacers, for example. They made arguably the biggest trade of the deadline, reaching an agreement with the Toronto Raptors to acquire all-star forward Pascal Siakam in the final year of his contract. In return, they would send Toronto Bruce Brown, Jordan Nwora, 2 first-round picks in 2024, what right now would be the 16th and 27th pick in the draft, as well as their first-round pick in 2026 with a top 4 protection. While it was baked into the price, this is still a pretty hefty package for someone with only months remaining on their contract. But considering where the Pacers were at the time, the risk seemed well worth it. They'd become one of the biggest surprises of the season on the back of the ascension of Haliburton at the point guard position, along with their combination of both blistering pace and elite offensive efficiency. Their rebuild was over. It looked like this was the right time to make a big move, and Siakam seemed like an ideal fit. And since joining the team, that still looks like the case. Individually, he's found a lot of success in Indiana. His averages have remained pretty much the same. 21 points, 8 rebounds, and 4 assists a game, but he's been able to raise his efficiency across the board, now up to 54% from the field and 37% from 3. This production is not just sticking out in the box score, but is being felt by the team's output as well. Since the trade, the #1 offensive rating in Indiana's rotation belongs to Siakam. Now, unfortunately, despite that, the trade hasn't had quite the impact they expected in the win column. Prior to the move, the Pacers were 24-17. Since the trade, they've gone just 2 games above 500. They're the 7th seed in the Eastern Conference, with really no better chance at all to make a deep run in the postseason. But let's make things very clear, this has little to nothing to do with Siakam. Yes, he was a huge addition for them, but prior to the deadline, they also lost some big pieces. Bruce Brown going to Toronto and Buddy Hield going to Philly. Their backcourt had just taken a massive hit. But initially, that didn't really seem like the end of the world. They actually had a lot of depth there. Guys like Andrew Nembhard, TJ McConnell, and Benedict Mathurin. Their top pick from a year ago who was set to take on a lot of that responsibility being left behind. That is until only weeks after the deadline, he would suffer an injury, knocking him out for the rest of the season. Then at the same time that this backcourt is being ripped apart, we also see Haliburton going through his biggest slump of the year. He went from splits of 50-40 prior to the deadline to just 45-32 after. Once that's all considered, this team even just remaining above 500 should give you a lot of optimism about the potential impact of this trade in the future. Now that's obviously assuming there is a long-term future for Siakam with this team. This year's tournament so far has been an absolute blast, and what's been making it just a little bit more entertaining for me than it already is sweating out some entries on PrizePicks, the sponsor for today's video. It's a sports pick'em platform that's super simple. You just choose more or less on different players' stats, and you can win up to 100 times your entry. Here's what I've got going on for the championship. I'm really not overthinking it. The tournament has been defined by the bigs, most notably the 2 matching up tonight, Zach Edey and Donovan Clingan. I'm taking both of their points rebounds combo, hoping we get that battle we're all expecting. It both happen, 25 becomes 75. I'm really hyped for this game, and if you guys want to check out PrizePicks, if you click the link in the description and use promo code JIMMER when you sign up, they're going to match your first deposit all the way up to $100. Thank you PrizePicks for sponsoring. This trade looks like a massive win right now, but as mentioned, this is the final year of Siakam's contract. If he were to walk during free agency, this becomes a disaster quickly. But luckily, it does seem pretty likely that the 2 reach an agreement on a deal. Woj reported that Pascal Siakam is excited about the deal to the Pacers and is expected to be eager to work out a new contract with the franchise this summer. It's a somewhat similar situation for the other big name traded by Toronto this season, standout two-way wing OG Anunoby, who they sent to the New York Knicks. In exchange, they would get back 2 of New York's top young assets in RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickley. Initially, really for both sides, but especially New York, this trade looked like an absolute home run. Through OG's first 17 games, he was averaging 15 points and 5 rebounds, shooting 50% from the field and 36% from 3. Offensive efficiency that doesn't jump out, but there was no question his impact was being felt. The Knicks had gone 15-2 with him. He turned them into a defensive juggernaut, posting a 103.9 defensive rating compared to the 116.7 defensive rating they posted without him. What's even crazier is that entire stretch was without this team's defensive anchor in Mitchell Robinson. Their position in the Eastern Conference was looking better and better, so by the time the February 8th deadline rolled around, they decided to double down, giving up yet another young asset in Quentin Grimes, sending him to the Pistons in exchange for 2 veteran pieces, Bojan Bogdanovic, and Alec Burks. This move caused more and more people to start buying in. But it really wasn't long before things started to turn in the wrong direction. Anunoby dealt with an elbow injury that he's only just returning from. Julius Randle had been dealing with a shoulder injury for most of the season, but was widely expected to make his return at some point. However, that never happened, and eventually we learned it wouldn't this year, as he had to undergo season-ending surgery. Then, while Quentin Grimes' time in Detroit got off to a terrible start, averaging only 5 points, shooting 21% from the field through his first 6 games, before getting shut down with a knee injury for the remainder of the season, New York was also not getting what they expected from that trade. Bojan Bogdanovic had been averaging 20 points prior to the deal, and while the volume was expected to take a big hit coming to New York and did, as he's now averaging only 10 points a game, the efficiency wasn't. But unfortunately, so far he's shooting with just 42-35 splits. Not ideal. But even more so is what we're seeing from Alec Burks, averaging just 7 points, shooting only 31% from the field. With all that, it should come as no surprise this has been a much different team lately. Since the deadline, they have just a 12-13 record. Now, luckily, things are starting to finally creep in the right direction. Mitchell Robinson's back, OG Anunoby's back, their season's far from over. But their chances at a deep playoff run, that's still not looking too great. Now, when it just comes to whether or not they were winners or losers from their in-season trades, you really just can't argue with the results. The on and off numbers for OG Anunoby are rivaled by very few in the league right now. So considering how much of this core is already under contract for next season, if a new deal is reached with Anunoby, this trade still has a chance to be an absolute home run. The same can also be said for the other half of both this trade and the Siakam trade, the Toronto Raptors. RJ Barrett's playing the best basketball of his career, averaging 21 points, 6 rebounds and 4 assists on 55-42 splits. Immanuel Quickley's averaging 18 and 7 as a 40% three-point shooter. Toronto had delayed their rebuild far too long, but starting off this next era with a young core of Barnes, RJ, and Quickley is really not too bad of a spot to be in. Then the final team that we saw get super aggressive during an otherwise pretty uneventful trade deadline was the Dallas Mavericks. What's clearly been a common theme so far is that while most of these big trades still look like the right decisions, it's been injuries and other external factors getting in the way of seeing their true potential. That's not the case with the Mavericks. Few, if any, teams in the league are hotter than them right now. A stark contrast to a year ago after they also made one of the biggest moves of the deadline, trading for Kyrie, a deal that unsurprisingly to absolutely everyone had a positive impact on the team offensively, but also unsurprisingly only made their biggest flaws more glaring, and that was defense. The team fell apart to close the year, and eventually we saw them forced to make a decision: try to squeak in the play-in or tank in the hopes of holding on to their first round selection, as if they didn't land inside the top 10, it would be going to the Knicks. They eventually decided on the tank, and while barely, it was successful. They missed out on the play-in and went to the lottery with the 10th best odds, a position they remained following the lottery, allowing them to retain their pick. Now, come the time of that selection, they didn't end up making it. They decided to trade down to 12 with the Oklahoma City Thunder. At 12, they would select Duke 7-footer and former #1 high school recruit Derek Lively, and in the process, they unloaded the contract of Davis Bertans, creating a traded player exception, a trade exception they would use to make another deal on draft night, taking on the contract of Rashawn Holmes, and in return would receive the 24th pick from the Sacramento Kings, a spot they would use to select Marquette forward Omax Prosper. By the end of the night, it was nearly impossible to argue that the Mavericks weren't one of the biggest winners of the draft. Not only did they barely hold on to their first round selection, but by going down just 2 spots, they had walked away with 2 first-round selections that also showed a clear goal and focus for the offseason, bringing in defense, something we saw carry over into free agency. They made some low-risk minimum signings: Dante Exum, who at that point had been out of the league for multiple years, and Derrick Jones Jr., who they signed for even less than his player option with Chicago that he had only recently declined. They also reached an agreement using their mid-level exception to bring in Matisse Thybulle on a 3-year, $33 million deal, but unfortunately, because he was a restricted free agent, the Blazers ended up matching it. The biggest move for them was their 3-team deal with the Spurs and Celtics. The Mavericks gave up Reggie Bullock, multiple second-round picks, and the biggest part of the deal, the right to swap their 2030 first-rounder with no protection in exchange for Grant Williams via a sign-and-trade. By the time the offseason was all said and done, all wrapped up, it really didn't seem like you could have asked for a better job from Nico Harrison. He turned the 10th pick into 2 very promising defensive prospects, made several low-risk, high-reward signings that had clear intentions. Without many assets at his disposal, was able to get creative with a sign and trade to bring in Grant Williams. And then the most important, signed Kyrie to a new contract. If that didn't happen, none of the other stuff would have mattered. Then we see the season tip off, and initially, it appears like all that effort by the front office was gonna pay off. They won their first 4 games of the season, 6 of their first 7, 9 of their first 12. By now, no one is doubting the fit between Kyrie and Luka Doncic. They were the unquestioned top offensive backcourt in the league. Their rookie Derek Lively was shocking everyone, stepping in as a starter and giving them a presence at the rim on both ends the Mavericks hadn't had in the Luka era. Some of those minimum low-risk flyers were really impressing in big roles. Jones Jr. had become a starter, being relied on more than anyone on the defensive end. Dante Exum had took advantage of some injuries to show just how much he had added to his game since his departure from the league. In so many aspects, things were better than the Mavericks had hoped for. However, in some, they were nowhere even close. While so many of those additions were exceeding expectations, their biggest of the offseason, Grant Williams, was falling extremely short of them. Offensively, he was bringing little to nothing at all, outside of the occasional pick and pop or corner 3. With the Mavericks this season, he averaged only 8 points, shooting 41% from the field. That wasn't the biggest issue, however. The Mavericks brought him in for what he could do defensively, but it was starting to look like they might have only added a liability. Of all the players in the main rotation, he posted the lowest net rating. Not just that, he ended up with a team low in both defensive and offensive rating. Then to make things even less ideal, it was looking like his fit off the court might actually be worse than it was on the court. Tim McMahon of ESPN reported that Grant Williams rubbed people the wrong way. The yapping obviously, that's kind of part of it with him. It's charmingly obnoxious if he's productive, and it's irritating when he's not. Williams didn't report to training camp in good shape, and Grant Williams not in good shape is not a good defender. He's proven throughout the course of his career that when he is in good shape, he can be an impactful defender, but that's not the guy the Mavericks got. Then we would eventually get reports of a rift specifically in the relationship between Williams and Luka Doncic.
I remember, just to share a quick story with you guys. So one day in practice, a player, a teammate, I won't call his name out, but it was Grant Williams. He decided he wanted to get under Luka's skin. He felt that Luka didn't come to practice, come that day ready to practice. So make a long story short, they had a scrimmage going, and he's talking trash to Luka up and down the court. So finally, Luka says, okay. And I tell you, Luka went on a 26-6 run by himself.
Oh my gosh.
And look, you can ask anybody, I'm not exaggerating. It was like a 26-6 run by himself. He showed everything, the threes, the post-up, the floaters, everything by himself.
Was Luka talking?
No. Didn't say a word.
When obnoxious, unnecessary trash talk collides with a complete lack of production on the court, usually things don't go too well for that player. And by the time the trade deadline rolled around, things for both Williams and the team as a whole were only getting worse. They were now the 8th seed, only a few games ahead of the 11th-seeded Houston Rockets. Things were going okay offensively, ranked the 10th best offense at the time, but defensively, it was really now looking like all that effort put in the offseason might have been for nothing. They sat with the 7th worst defensive rating in the league. In fact, the team actually had a negative net rating at the time, meaning there was a chance that their record, while still only being barely above 500, might have been deceiving. So in order to save themselves from another late season disaster, it was looking like once again, they were going to be making a big move at the deadline. And if a big move were to go down, it was almost certainly going to involve Grant Williams. Eventually, they would reach an agreement with the Charlotte Hornets, receiving PJ Washington in exchange for Grant Williams and their 2027 first, only with a light protection. This was unquestionably a massive upgrade, but it was also one that probably was a tough pill to swallow for this front office. They had now pretty much given up a 2030 pick swap and a 2027 first rounder in exchange for PJ Washington. A really solid young player, but by no means someone that was setting the NBA on fire at the time. He was averaging 14 points, shooting with just 45-32 splits. From a value standpoint, things might not have exactly lined up, but it was becoming clear that really didn't matter too much to Dallas. They were going all in. They were committed to avoiding another late season disaster. This became pretty obvious after their second deal of the deadline. making a trade with Oklahoma City to acquire a 2024 first-round pick. In return, they would give up the right to swap their first in 2028. They would then send that newly acquired 2024 first, along with the contract of Richaun Holmes, to the Washington Wizards in exchange for Daniel Gafford. There was no question, with these moves, the Mavericks had now gotten significantly better. But there were, however, some serious questions about what they had to give up to do so. Over the last year, the Mavericks had now given up the upside or the pick entirely in 2027, 2028, 2029, and 2030. This complete disregard for their future draft capital was so apparent that some, most notably Bill Simmons, speculated it was Mark Cuban pulling a lot of the strings.
Here's my Mark Cuban Hail Mary theory. So he knows he's selling the team for basically the last year. They trade a 2029 first for Kyrie Irving. Last summer they do a 2030 pick swap with San Antonio so they could create space to get Grant Williams. They trade Grant Williams this week with a 2027 first to get PJ Washington. And then to get another pick so they can get Daniel Gafford, they do a 2028 pick swap with OKC, who's happy to do that because God only knows if Luke is going to be on the Mavericks 4 years from now. It's a smart move. Why would they do all this? Why would they be going all in on a team that is still not even top 4 in the West? The answer is Mark Cuban doesn't know if he's going to be there this summer. Because when he sold the team, he kept 27% of it, but he gave up his governor's seat. How long is he going to be running basketball operations if things don't go well? I'll give you a hint. Not long. Yeah, I don't care about picks 27, 28, 29, 2030. Who cares? I might not be here anyway. But if I can salvage it this year, maybe they'll keep me. Mark Cuban, throw in the Hail Marys.
Now again, just to make things very clear, this is all just pure speculation, but definitely some fun food for thought, especially with how successful those trade deadline moves appear to be. Since those moves, the Mavericks have a record of 19-7, the second best record in the league during that stretch of time. They've posted the 3rd best net rating, the 4th best offensive rating, and the 6th best defensive rating. Then somehow, things have gotten even crazier in March after a pretty simple change from Jason Kidd, inserting Daniel Gafford and Derrick Jones into the starting lineup in place of Derek Lively and Josh Green. A new starting lineup that's led them to a 13-2 record over their last 15 games, the best record in the entire league during that stretch, where they've posted the 8th best offensive rating, and this is actually wild, the number 1 defensive rating. Again, at least for right now, it looks like they did it. This time last year, they were decimated on that end of the floor. A lot of effort was put in during the offseason to turn things around. That didn't quite have the results they expected, but they continued to be active, and after a busy deadline, this is a completely different team. We obviously don't know how sustainable it is. I think it would be a little ridiculous to actually look at them as one of the better defensive teams in the league, but it is safe to say they're definitely not the worst. A scary combination considering just how out of their minds Luka and Kyrie are playing. Throughout this stretch, they're combining for 58 points, shooting 50% from the field and 39% from 3. This new Dallas starting 5, Kyrie, Luka, Derrick Jones, PJ Washington, and Daniel Gafford, just can't be stopped. They've got a 23.5 net rating since the start of March, a 115.8 offensive rating, and a league-leading 92.4 net rating. Absurd. The trade for Daniel Gafford right now is looking like absolute highway robbery. The team saw the value that a rim protector, pick and roll presence, and lob threat like Derek Lively was able to bring to this team. So at the deadline, they doubled down, and the results are better than they could have ever imagined. Gafford right now legitimately looks like one of the top rim protectors in the NBA, but his value is going beyond that. The defensive focus and energy it takes to try and slow down Luka and Kyrie has allowed Gafford, who is already one of the most efficient players at the rim, to generate pretty easy looks night in and night out. We recently saw a 5-game stretch from him where he was averaging 15 points, shooting 100% from the field. Yes, over those 5 games, he went 33 for 33 from the floor. Since coming to the Mavericks, he's shooting 75% from the field. Offensively, he's a match made in heaven for Luka and Kyrie. Then defensively, he's a match made in heaven for Derrick Jones Jr., someone that's taking on the best matchup on a nightly basis, and the results speak for themselves. Then there's PJ Washington. The addition by subtraction of Grant Williams has made him a pretty big positive on that end. Then offensively, while he hasn't been anything spectacular, 12 points on only 43-33 splits, the value he brings on that end is still incomparable to Grant Williams, given 2 main factors: his ability as an individual shot creator and his scalability as a scorer, something I've talked about quite a bit on this channel and can be vital for a roster. For someone like Grant Williams, nothing changes with injuries across the roster. He flat out just doesn't have the ability to increase his volume in any significant way. That's far from the case for PJ Washington. We just saw that in their recent game against the Warriors where Luka was on the sidelines and Washington stepped up, dropping 32 points, 5 rebounds and 3 assists, going 12 for 18 from the field and 5 for 8 from 3.
7 seconds, driving, Washington underneath, lays it in, 4.5 to go!
Right now, this starting lineup is firing on all cylinders going into the playoffs, but they also have a group of Hardaway Jr., Dante Exum, Josh Green, Maxi Kleber, and Derek Lively coming off the bench. They are becoming a legit threat. They're flying up the Vegas championship odds, and I can guarantee you fear is starting to set in for the rest of the Western Conference.